To date, we have discussed the economic and political classifications anthropologists use to describe various groups. Let's review them. You can say them along with me. 4 patterns of subsistence: foraging, horticulture, pastoralism, and agriculture. 3 patterns of exchange: reciprocity, redistribution, and market exchange. And 4 patterns of political integration: under decentralized, bands and tribes, and under centralized, chiefdoms and states. We've also started to discuss how some of these classifications and characteristics overlap, merging economic and political dynamics, thereby affirming the holistic perspective that's so central to anthropology. Foraging, I noted, as a subsistence pattern, was tied to the band form of political integration and to reciprocal forms of exchange. In this lecture, we will turn to another case where political and economic dynamics are closely entwined: the state level of centralized political integration. That's tied to agriculture as a subsistence pattern and to redistributive and market forms of exchange. We'll also look at a case where the connections between economic and political dynamics are far more ambiguous. The pastoral subsistence pattern may encourage both tribal and chiefly forms of political integration. We'll also look at how horticulture can exist with chiefdoms or with tribes. The point is, in some cases, economic and political dynamics very much are entwined one with the other. In other cases, they're not. The question we're leading to is this: do the classifications the anthropologists use to classify all these societies really make sense? The ones they use in textbooks and the lectures that you memorize, do those really make sense? The other clear relationship we want to look at is between states, agriculture, and 2 forms of exchange: redistribution and market exchange. It makes sense here again to look at a specific example, and we'll take the Bunyoro Kingdom of Uganda in Africa. It involves a group of people called the Nyoro and comprises about 100,000 people. Since the kingdom has changed in modern times, we'll look at mainly a historical reconstruction of it. Following the theme that states often involve diverse cultural groups, the kingdom is believed to historically had 3 separate ethnic groups: the original agricultural people, a pastoral invading group called the Huma, and more recently an invading group of pastoralists called the Bito. It is the Bito from whom the kings of modern times trace their descent. The Bito king exercised formal sovereignty over the entire society and land. It was expressed in his sacred character. His well-being was critical for the well-being of his people. If he sickened, the whole country suffered. Authority to administer certain areas within the kingdom were delegated by the king to the chiefs, and these positions tend to pass down among certain families. The chiefs constituted links between the rural populations, who provide tribute to the king with foodstuffs, valuables, cattle, or warriors, and the king. In the Bunyoro organization, the key element was a patrilineal descent system that provided the basis for corporate groups at the local or village level. Imposed in this patrilineal descent system was a feudal one with the king at the top. Most Nyaro were small farmers who cultivated millet, sweet potatoes, and cassava on roughly 5 to 7 acres. In earlier times, they often had large herds of cattle, but these were decimated by disease and warfare. The Nyoro were very much involved in market exchange, not only in terms of cash crops such as cotton and tobacco, but in early times in terms of salt. They controlled the salt trade between Lake Victoria and the Indian Ocean. They also, intriguingly, traded in ivory. Surplus goods were extracted as tribute from the commoners, funneled up via the chiefs to the king, who then redistributed them to reinforce loyalty to him.
Professor Borofsky, I have a question. You refer to the Bunyoro as a state built on conquest. Are most states built on conquest? Would you say the American state system is based on the conquest of the American Indians?
A complicated question. Archaeologists, when they speak about the rise of states, such as the ancient states in Mesopotamia or in Mesoamerica, tend to focus on 3 different possibilities. There's the need for complex irrigation systems that entail complex political arrangements because of having to organize the flow of water among all these different agricultural plots. There's also, the second is a redistributive dynamics of trade across a broad area in diverse ecological zones, led to power being centralized in the hands of a few. And third was the competition for land within a circumscribed area that led to conquest and state formation. In terms of Ben-Ur, clearly they had a conquest state. I don't know if they were originally state when the Beto came in and took over from the Huma or not. Just don't know. But what's interesting here is it wasn't a circumscribed area, and it's unlikely there was irrigation played a major role here. It might have been about trade because we talked about salt trade before. It's interesting that in Hawaii, competition for land led to conflict and stratification, but it did not lead to state formation until after Western contact. In terms of the second part of your question, yes, the United States expanded and conquered the American Indians, especially during the Indian Wars of the second half of the 19th century. But the American state was already formed at that time. The United States was a state at its very founding. Relationships between politics and economy is much more ambiguous when we go to horticulturalists and pastoralists on the one hand, and tribes and chiefdoms on the other. Reciprocity, redistribution, and market exchange all play varying roles here. Let's look at pastoralists. Pastoralists tend to form tribes. The Nuer in the Republic of Southern Sudan are a good example. They form their ties on the basis of kinship. The Nuer number about 200,000, and they live in swamplands and savanna grasslands. They raise cattle. Lacking an overall overarching government, orderly relations between various territorial divisions is ambiguous, but is based on ties of kinship. Perhaps 20 patrilineal clans exist, and each is segmented into lineages. The Nuer have no permanent leadership or political organization above the minimal lineage segment at the local community. All that exists is an ideal. Members of the same clan should A, combine in raiding and defense, B, share a common territory and bonds of common sentiment, and C, feuds within the clan are supposed to be resolved by arbitration. The basis of newer groupings beyond the minimal lineage segment, or local group, involves what is called segmentary opposition. You can see it in terms of this chart. Lineages at various levels may align themselves together based on who they are opposing. On the one hand, sometimes they'll be together opposing a third party, and sometimes these two parties will be fighting with one another. As the newest state, we fight against a Ringan, but when either of us is fighting a third party, we combine with a Ringan. Let's look at the relationship between horticulture and tribes and chiefdoms. On the tribal end with horticulture, we see examples of what are called bigmen, and these are common in Melanesia. Reciprocity is important among these bigmen, but so are elements of redistribution. I'll make 4 general points. First, the bigman's authorities are personal. He doesn't have his authority based on kinship or being elected. It's on his own charisma, his own ability to draw people in to follow him. Second, he gains power by building a group of followers. They become obligated to him in the way he distributes wealth to them and how they benefit from assistance from the big man. Third, the big man plays an important role in trade beyond the local community. He draws in the local community's goods, passes them into a trade network, and then when he gets something back, redistributes them to the community. Fourth, his position is a very precarious one. He may rise or fall depending on how many followers he can mobilize.
Professor Borofsky, I have a question. Is a big man something like our Western politicians, always having to gain supporters through our distribution of wealth and favors?
Yes, that is exactly correct. The same skills that the big man needs, drawing in supporters by the distribution of favors and gifts, is what political machines and political bosses do in Western societies. Both exist in relatively egalitarian societies, so they cannot force others necessarily to do their bidding. They have to control and manipulate them in more subtle ways.